just MailChimped my marketing.
You MailChimped your what?
I MailChimped my marketing with AI to create an effective marketing campaign in minutes.
No, MailChimp and Way.
Yes, MailChimp and Way. Now I can hyper-personalize my campaigns across email and SMS.
You can do all that with MailChimp?
What did I just MailChimp and say?
MailChimp your marketing with the #1 AI-powered email marketing and automation platform, Intuit MailChimp. #1 based on publicly available data on competitors' customers. Plans vary. SMS available as add-ons. Visit MailChimp.com.
V.C. Andrews, unfortunately, passed away, and then they kept writing
going.
the books under her name, and it got even progressively more crazy. So it's like, oh, your mom and your dad aren't your brother and sister. Well, now the grandkids are also dating, and it's like it's just.
What kind of intergenerational mess is this? Hi, Deesha.
Hey, Dawnie.
And welcome, everyone, to Ursa Short Fiction, the podcast where we geek out on our favorite short stories. I'm Dawnie Walton, author of the final revival of Opal and Nev.
And I'm Deesha Philyaw, author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, and I have a little bit of a cold today, so please pardon the way I sound.
You sound great as always, Deesha.
Thank you.
As always, this show is produced with support from you. Become an Ursa member today by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll get exclusive bonus episodes, and you'll help fund future stories and conversations. Today, we're excited to welcome our friend, the brilliant S.A. Cosby. Sean, as we call him, is an Anthony Award-winning writer from southeastern Virginia. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, was a New York Times notable book, and was named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, The Guardian, and Library Journal, among others. He also happens to be the editor of the 2024 edition of the Best American Mystery and Suspense, out on the day we're recording this episode. How exciting! Very timely. When not writing, he is an avid hiker and chess player. Deesha, why don't you give the folks a little bit of intel on what we have in store today?
So, talking with Sean is always a good time. I think the first time he and I met was, I think we were at the Key West Literary Seminar, and he was there with his wife, and we went out drinking the night before. And the man is just a natural storyteller, with or without whiskey. And so I think today will probably, is without whiskey. I could listen to Sean, what do they say, read the phone book. He's such a gifted storyteller. He has really been my introduction to the crime genre, and because I, just fell in love with his books and then listened to them on audiobooks. So I'm really excited to hear what's new with him.
Yeah, the audiobooks are so good. Mm-hmm. I'm in the middle of listening to Razorblade Tears right now, and It's just like, parts of it are so gruesome, but it also has this dark humor. The characters are, just like these former felons who are avenging the murders of their sons, and some really wild things happen in this novel, but the characters are also just so colorful and funny.
Absolutely.
And I actually met Sean for the first time maybe about 3 weeks ago. We were both in Paris, halfway, like across the world, at Festival America.
Yes.
And I don't know if you knew this, but in France, crime fiction is like the most popular genre by far.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Sean was a very popular author there. And it was so cool to meet him because, of course, you see like interviews with him, and I've seen his author photos so many times. And I just felt like at Festival America, there were so many authors that I felt like the author photo was like coming to life 3D.
Yes.
And it was like, I was a little bit starstruck. So I kind of like very shyly came up to his table and introduced myself. And he's just so warm and lovely, and our Southern brother. So we're very excited to talk with him today, especially because Halloween is right around the corner. And we're going to talk about thrills, chills, all those kinds of stories, how they make us feel, and how he does what he does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So without further ado, here's our conversation with S.A. Cosby. Heaven was the one with the like.
Oh yeah, Heavenly with the dark
my
hair.
God. Yeah. Wow. Did young men read those books?
I did because my grandmother read them. And so when my grandmother, I grew up reading around my grandmother, my mother, my uncle, my aunt, everybody in my family read. So I was a voracious reader. So whenever she was done with them, I just grabbed them. But when you're 12, you don't know what half the words mean. So it's like you got to keep looking up stuff like, what does tumescent mean? Oh God.
Oh God.
And I've never seen words like that anywhere else except for these books.
Nowhere else.
Oh,
and it was
gosh.
like, oh my God, the grandmother is poisoning the kids and the
Through
mom's
the
just out.
donuts, not the powdered donuts.
Right. And the mom's out leading her life and having a whole, grand social life, got a new husband, and we were riveted.
It was crazy. Those books are insane. Like, and she, V.C. Andrews unfortunately passed away, and then they kept writing
going.
the books under her name, and they got even progressively more crazy. So,
Wow.
They're like, we're gonna attribute this to this dead lady, so we can just do whatever.
We don't. Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, your mom and your dad aren't your brother and sister. Well, now the grandkids are also dating, and it's like it's just.
Grandkids dating.
What kind of intergenerational mess is this? Where this keeps happening again and again.
It's like y'all need to do a DNA test just to make sure, like, what is going on? There's some generational sickness that somebody needs to address. I always imagine in those books, though it's not in the books, but I always wanted to imagine like they had some black neighbors that like would look over there like them kids all look alike.
Exactly.
not in the
Something in the milk ain't clean. Something in the milk ain't clean.
I need somebody to do a skit on that on TikTok. Listen.
If the flowers in the attic were black.
Yeah. They had black neighbors.
Oh God.
I can hear a black mom now telling the kids, no, you can't go over there and play with them. No, not absolutely not.
Nope.
They nasty.
When these little dry ass donuts, don't be bringing something back.
Don't be bringing them stale donuts back over here. I told you about eating at people's houses.
Oh my gosh.
Who all gonna be over there?
Okay.
You can't go.
Oh, Sean, it is delightful to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you guys for inviting me.
I know you're so busy ripping and running. I just met you in Paris, which was so lovely at Festival America.
Wasn't that wonderful? That was so crazy. I'm sitting in Paris with, wearing my Chuck Taylors and everything. And like, big old country boy. And then I was like, the fine Parisian environment. I love Paris, though. It doesn't matter who you are as a writer over there. They treat every writer as a celebrity. It's such a great deal.
Yeah. And I know particularly they love crime fiction in France.
Yeah, which I was surprised. I write very, for folks that listen to me, I know I write very specific Southern rural crime, noir, crime fiction, Southern Gothic fiction. And so, I don't know, I didn't know how it would relate to folks in Paris and other countries. But I've been very lucky. The people in Paris have shown me such great affection and, being able to go over there. And I've been over there twice in the last 2 years, and it's just an incredible experience. It's so much fun. They're so nice. I've become a French wine snob since I've been going to France.
Yes.
Because, I grew up in rural Virginia, and so the finest wines that I'd ever drank before going to France was like MD 2020 and Boone's Farm. And so
not Mad Dog. Oh my God.
Yes.
I can smell it right now. Ooh, Jesus.
Man, when you talk about the vintage, that was a good week. And so and so I got to France, and the first time I got to France, they took me out to dinner. I was over there with Gabino Iglesias and Katrina Ward, and they took us all out to dinner, and we had like these fancy bottles of Bordeaux and Merlot, and all that. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, it's all right. No, I drank that wine. This is amazing. I come back home, and I'm like, I can't go back.
Can't go back.
I love that. Again, we are so happy to have you with us today. And, we were kicking off this conversation talking about our childhoods. And, as lifelong readers and lovers of stories, so many of us started that love with ghost stories or with novel series like Bunnicula or The Celery Stalks at Midnight or anything with that Goosebumps brand.
Mm-hmm.
And as a kid, I remember those, but also that the first short story I think I ever read was actually Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. So I'm just curious, I want to get back in the mind of 12-year-old Sean and what he was reading that really got your heart pumping and inspired you to write thrillers.
So the first adult grown up short story I remember reading that wasn't Hardy Boys or the Three Investigators. Also, anybody listening, I'm a rabid Three Investigators fan. So Three Investigators were a series of books that were a little more hardcore than the Hardy Boys. One of the Three Investigators, they're all kids. They're all like under 15. One of them lives in a junkyard. The other one is gets bullied a lot, and the other one is like their friend who's athletic. So it was really cool books to see sort of these guys become friends across their different social hierarchies and solve mysteries. I always was a big. The Hardy Boys were a little too sedate for me because it always, I didn't relate to them because their rich dad always got them out of trouble. But the first grown-up short story, you mentioned Edgar Allan Poe, the first grown-up short story I ever read was The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. And it was in an anthology of horror stories that my mom used to go to yard sales a lot. We were really poor growing up, and so she would go there and shop, and she would always pick up paperbacks and books for me because you know how much I love to read, and she also loved to read as well. And so I remember reading The Black Cat, and I fell in love with Edgar Allan Poe. Then the very next story in that book, which is still to this day one of my favorite short stories, I think one of the great American short stories of all time, is The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. And I can still remember the last two lines, Well, for God's sake, Fortunato. Yes, for God's sakes. And so Cask of Amontillado is the story of this really crazy dude who's ticked off at this dude named Fortunato, and he tricks him into coming down into a crypt, into a basement type setting. And for reasons that he never explains, he walls him up alive in the basement. And he doesn't really elaborate on why he's ticked off at this dude, but, he must really be angry because he's gone through all this trouble to build, get these bricks and cement and everything else. And so for me, those stories sort of awakened this fascination for me as a reader, but also as someone who was beginning to want to write my own stories. So there's an incredible sort of magic that happens when you read a story by a really, really talented writer, and you realize how much power a writer has, that it can make you see things, make you feel things. And I wanted to do that. And so reading those stories was the first one that really awakened that in me.
Mm-hmm. So as you all were reminiscing, I remembered Encyclopedia Brown. Did y'all read those?
I love Encyclopedia
little
Brown.
minute mysteries, and I could never solve them. And Bugs Meany, the villain. We're going to talk about villains later, but he was the bully. But I'm going to date myself here as the elder in the virtual room, because when Goosebumps first came on my radar, I was an elementary school teacher with students, some of whom didn't want to read anything but Goosebumps. And some of my colleagues actually insisted that their students read something else during their free reading time because in their estimation, those books didn't count. They weren't literature. And Dawnie, I was like you in that The Telltale Heart was my introduction to the short story, or at the very least, it was the most memorable short story I read. And as a teenager, Stephen King was my introduction to book-length scary stories, starting with Carrie. And King, of course, is a master of many genres: horror, suspense, crime, science fiction, fantasy, mystery. But we never read him in school either. So, Sean, if you were teaching, say, middle school or high school English, what would be on your syllabus?
I think the first thing that I would ask my students to read are the early 20th century horror short stories. And there's a whole subgenre of Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, Algernon Blackwood, not so much H.P. Lovecraft, but some of those guys, especially Robert Bloch. And the first short story I would have them read is a short story. I know a lot of people maybe haven't heard of it. It's called The Animal Fair. And it's a short story. The setup is a young man is hitchhiking across country, and he comes to a small town in Oklahoma, and they're having a fair, a carnival, traveling carnival. And one of the exhibits at the carnival is Safari Jack. And Safari Jack has supposedly exotic animals, but they're, it's a rundown carnival. So the lion that's there is kind of drugged up. He doesn't have teeth. And there's a couple other animals. And there's a gorilla in there. And the gorilla looks sick and sad. And at the end of the night, the carnival's moving to another city. And so this young man who's an unnamed narrator catches a ride with Safari Jack in his truck. And Safari Jack tells him the story of his life. And so before he worked for this rundown carnival, he was a stuntman in Hollywood. And he was taking care of his niece. His niece fell in with a bunch of bad guys, a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, that they used to say back then. And he also tells a story about his time in Africa as a safari hunter. And he talks about African voodoo, hoodoo, traditional African religions, and how they can make you believe you're an animal. They can make you believe you're a god. There's so many things that they can do. And then there's a twist to the story because his niece fell in with these bad characters. And so he hunted down the bad characters one after another. And the end of the story, I don't want to ruin it for anyone, is one of the great twists in horror fiction. It's only about 8 pages long. I love that short story. Robert Bloch was a master of both short story and novels. As far as novels, I think there would be 2. One would be Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Not just because it's one of the great American horror novels, and we're talking, close to Halloween. Salem's Lot is also a great American novel examining the late 70s in America. A lot of that novel, besides the vampires, has to do with gasoline shortage, has to do with change in politics, the death of sort of the hippie movement, the death of the love generation. And the vampires are sort of a metaphor for sort of the dissolution of that generation. And King does a great job sort of articulating both sides of that argument. The other book that I would have kids read at that time, and I think high school students are able to absorb this, is not a horror novel, but is my favorite book. Well, it's in my top 10. is Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres, based on or inspired by the Shakespearean play King Lear. I think 1,000 Acres is one of the great American novels of the last 50 years. And so those would be probably the 3 first things that I'd have on my syllabus.
Oh, I'm sitting here taking notes,
yes.
And also I'm just sitting here rocking back and forth and smiling because you're such a great storyteller.
Yes.
Sean. Telling the stories of other stories, I'm enthralled. Yes. So I'm going to ask kind of a long-winded question, but I promise it has a point. So I recently moderated a New York event celebrating a debut novel by my good friend Afabwaje Kyrian. Her novel is called When the Mango Ripens. It's about this town in 1970s Nigeria and the waning days of white American missionaries there. And it's this super literary historical fiction. But one of the things I asked Afa about was how she achieved the pacing of the novel, because it starts like this slow burn, but by the halfway mark, I'm in a total chokehold. And the pages are flying as all these characters' secrets get revealed. And during our event, I asked Afa how she managed to do that. And I'm not sure what I was expecting her to say, but her answer knocked me out, and it made so much sense. She said, I read a lot of crime fiction. And that really made me think, I'm wondering if you can speak to that. What other things can writers of all genres learn from crime, from thrillers, from suspense, from those genres that keep us in a chokehold?
That's a great question. And I think I say this a lot. So there's 2 things, I guess, technical and sort of narratively, and I guess also aesthetically. So for me, I always say that crime fiction is the gospel of the dispossessed. I say that because crime fiction, I always say this when people ask me this, I've read a lot. I've been, I love to read. So let's say you're somebody who maybe you don't want to read American Stain by Philip Roth because you can't relate to, an upper Northeast college professor who's passing. But everybody understands pain. And maybe you don't want to read 1,000 Acres because you can't relate to a Nebraska farm family with 1,000-acre farm and secrets that are bubbling up from the bottom coming to the surface. But everybody understands desperation. Everybody's been in a situation, unless you were, lucky enough to be born into wealth, where maybe you had a bill that was coming due, and you had to make a choice between, am I going to pay this bill or I'm going to put gas in my car? Everybody can't understand what it feels like to be an FBI agent like Will Graham in Red Dragon, but everybody understands fear. And so for me, what you can learn and what I've learned writing crime fiction is this sort of preeminence of movement in the story. I have a friend, Todd Robinson, who's he used to publish a magazine called Thug Lit, and a lot of crime writers that are successful today were first discovered in Thug Lit. And he has this sort of funny sort of cheeky thing he says about literary novels. And he says, a lot of literary novels are 500 pages of people talking about maybe doing something. And so crime fiction is always people making decisions, and decisions that have consequences that not only drive their emotional narrative, but drive the story narrative. Crime fiction is not so much a place where you go for fascinating plots. There's only about 5 or 6 plots. But crime fiction is a place where you can go and learn how to move a story, how to make the action move the narrative, how dialogue can move the action and create action. And so for me, when I write, I always have in mind that this is a story that's supposed to be fun. I talk about a lot of serious issues. I talk about racism, homophobia, misogyny, talk about classism, family dynamics, father and son relationships, mother and son relationships. But at my core, I remember what we're going to remark what Stephen King said again. It's like, nobody will care about what your book is about if it's boring. And so for me, crime fiction taught me how to make the story exciting without sacrificing the larger metaphorical and aesthetic things that I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Listen in. Starbucks. It's a great day for coffee.
I'd love to talk about the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2024, which, congratulations, is out today.
Thank you.
Co-edited by you and Steph Cha.
Yes.
Yeah, we're so curious, working as an editor on that, were there particular things you were looking for in choosing the stories? Because I'm sure you had a wealth of them to select from.
One of the things that I put a preeminence on when I'm reading short stories or when I'm writing them, and in this case, when I'm selecting them, is I wasn't so concerned about specific sort of hard and fast genre designations. They had to be a mystery or suspense, but it could be a cozy, it could be hard-boiled. There's actually a story in there that's sort of a Western. And so those subgenres weren't what I was concerned about. What I was mainly concerned about is, does this story move? And does this story create a sense of excitement, dread, wonder, mystery? Does this story engage you immediately on page 1 or 2? Because I have this theory that short stories have to engage you in the first 3 paragraphs. Short stories are, again, I'm going to quote Mr. King again, short stories are like a kiss in the dark. It's a brief moment, and you have to really engage the reader almost from page 1. Novels give you room to luxuriate in your words, and I have a problem with that. My editor always teasing me that she has to limit me to 2 similes per page, because I will go off on a tangent. With short stories, you don't really have that luxury. It's about the economy of style. It's about getting in, starting, laying your premise, giving the setup or the argument, and then the denouement. And so what I was looking for was stories like that grabbed you immediately. And all the stories that made it into the edition are stories that did that, regardless of whether, like I said, whether they were cozies, whether they were traditional mysteries, whether they were experimental. It had to be something that grabbed me immediately. That's how I am as a reader, and that's how I try to be as a writer.
And talking a bit more about, I'm sorry, any standout stories before I ask my question?
Oh, yeah. So there were 2 standout stories for me that all the stories are great. All the stories are amazing, and I really loved all of them. There was 2 that stood out for me. One was The Funeral Suit by Bobby Matthews, which is, like I said, a crime story sort of enveloped in Western tropes and cliches, but these cliches are sort of turned on their head. And I thought that the way that Matthews is able to bring you into this world that, is very familiar. It's a Western setting, but then also turn those expectations you have of a Western story on their head, I thought was amazing. The other standout story, and I'll tell you how good this story was. This story was first published in Southwest Review, and I was in that same issue, and I had a chance to read that story ahead of time. I rewrote my story because this story was so good.
Damn.
I can't come here and half stepping. This is I gotta get to this guy's level. It's called My Savage Year by Jordan Harper.
Jordan Harper, yes. Sorry, I had to fangirl.
Yeah, without any, I'm not being hyperbolic at all. It's probably one of the best short stories I've read in the last 25 years. It is so
Wow.
good. It is so amazing. And someone else described it online as, it's like going to see a magician and the magician telling you, this is how I did the trick. And you're still amazed when they pull it off. It's an amazing story. It's about a narrator who's telling a story about his high school teacher who murdered his family and got away with it, and how it affects him, how it affects the town, how it affects everyone in this small place in the Ozarks in Missouri. Jordan Harper is probably the best crime writer working today, in my opinion. Nobody thinks about writing the way he does. Nobody breaks it down the way he does. He used to have a newsletter called Welcome to the Hammer Party, where he broke down his theory of writing. And to read that story, and it's funny. I've been very blessed to be, successful with my books, and I think I'm a pretty decent writer. But I always like reading something that makes me feel like I have to step my game up. I have to get better because this is so good. I don't want anybody to compare me to this and look at me negatively. I got to be if not as good, I got to be in the same ballpark as this story of this book. And reading his work, whether it's his novels or whether it's this incredible short story, made me feel like that. So, all the stories in this collection are great. Scorpion is by Nick Kolakowski. There's a story about Alyssa Cole that's really good. All these stories are wonderful. For me, that story is just an amazing piece of work.
And one of the things we like to do on this podcast, Sean, is talk about the business of publishing and demystifying things and being really transparent. And so, lots of people, either submit their work for anthologies or hope to get in a best of or that sort of thing. And so other than picking the stories, can you talk a bit more about what's in the process? Sometimes we get hands-on actually editing, sometimes not. Also, you're thinking about the sort of shape of the whole anthology when you're choosing stories. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, the process was Steph Chalk, who's an incredible editor who leads this project, leads this anthology with such fearlessness and devotion to not only good storytelling, but also to diversity, and diversity in such a way that it is allowing good stories that normally maybe would get ignored to be acknowledged. And so for me, the process, Steph brought about 100 stories that she collected from all different avenues, from stories that she had read herself, some stories that were submitted to the website, because there's a website you can submit to, from people that suggested stories to her. And so she collated these 100 stories, and then we had to narrow those 100 down to 50. And then of those 50, she and I had to go back and forth and pick the 25 that we both liked the best. And so a story got in if both she and I liked it. And out of those 50 and that we narrowed it down to. And so, a lot of the stories that didn't get in were not bad stories. But perfectly honest, sometimes there were people who had been in a whole bunch of times and maybe were making room for a new person. Sometimes they were good stories, but they weren't contextually on the level of the stories that we were selecting. So again, there's a hierarchy here that, this is a good story, sometimes even a great story, but then you compare it to some of the other stories that were getting selected, and it was like, wow, it's just not quite there. Again, that's not to denigrate that story or that writer. Sometimes it was stories that got in that were they just like Savage Year, just come out that you just cannot look away from. Like you could not have this in this collection. And so we really got along well. We didn't argue a lot. Sometimes it was stories that one of us felt passionate about, but the other one wasn't feeling. And so we argued for those stories. But ultimately, I think we got the 25 best stories from the past year that really, for me, I didn't really have a unifying principle for the whole anthology. I just really wanted to get a good cross-section of what is being written today that's exciting, that's interesting. I mean, some people like to think of diversity as a dirty word, but all diversity really means is it's not all, just white guys. It's not all just, white women. It's not all just people that, maybe are folks that have already sort of gotten their due. Diversity means that we're looking outside what people have considered the standard. I always think of this thing about diversity when people to some people, when they hear the word diversity, it means that you didn't earn it. That's what people think. That's what some people think. They think, oh, diversity means you got special treatment. You're a DEI hire. But really, when we say diversity, what we're saying is these stories are just as good as anybody else's stories, but certain people didn't want to look that way. Certain people didn't want to acknowledge that. That's what diversity means. It's not special treatment. It's an equal chance. So
Yes, absolutely.
I am so excited to read this collection and really grateful to you for, adding your name as an editor to it and bringing more attention to these writers.
I got to tell you, for me, it was like a dream come true. One of the first things I ever read when I decided to maybe start writing crime fiction was the best American mystery and suspense stories. And I remember how excited I was when I was honorable mention back in 2017. It's from a lot of writers, especially new writers, it's like your first really cool thing that goes in your CV. Like for me, when I was my story Slant-Six was a distinguished story in 2017. I talked about that to everybody. I was like,
No, that's
I brought
right.
it up in every conversation. I worked it in the conversation that had no reason being in there. I like, if I got stopped by the cops, I'll be like, how fast are you going? I don't know, but I was a distinguished story in the last. I was so proud of it, and then actually get in the audition a couple of years ago was again such a great achievement. And so I think I tell you the thing for me, being a part of it, being an editor was great, but really the coolest thing was looking on social media and seeing people who were so excited to get in. And,
Yes.
and they weren't thanking me. They were just, and I didn't want them to thank me, but just see how excited from somebody like Megan Abbott, who is an established, amazing author in her own right, to people who this was their first publication. It's just the thing about being a writer. It is the world's loneliest solitary team sport. It's
Yes.
you, but it's the people around you that love you, that care about you, your friends, your family, your partners, what have you. And so there's many nights where, and I can't speak for anybody else, but I can just speak for myself. There are many nights as a writer where you second guess yourself. You doubt yourself. You think, do I have what it takes? Am I good enough? Is this good? And so that acknowledgement of being in this kind of anthology, I hope that it gives writers, especially new writers, or maybe an old writer that felt like they lost a step, it gives you the feeling that, no, you can do this. That you have what it takes. Like I like to say, you have the goods. And for me, it's just an incredible honor to see people so happy to be a part of it.
So exciting. So one of the things I'd love to talk about, one of the things that really grabs me about horror and crime novels and thrillers are the heroes and especially the villains and how they get built. Now, I've taught a class on larger than life characters in fiction, and I probably could have based the whole thing on horror alone because I'm thinking about bringing up Stephen King again. I'm thinking about iconic figures in those books like Pennywise, to one of my favorite villains of all time, the ambitious politician Greg Stilson in The Dead Zone, which is a great, great villain who feels, unfortunately today, all too real.
Yeah.
What do you think about when crafting your own heroes and villains, and what do you think is important to making them so visceral and memorable?
One big thing for me, and I learned this from comic books, I'm a huge comic book fan too, is if you're going to have a hero, your hero is only as good as your villain. Your hero has to be someone that is strong, someone that is intelligent, I think, someone that is determined. But if they don't have a villain that challenges them, that doesn't push them, then they can be kind of bland. And so when I'm creating heroes, I always have the villain in mind. Sometimes they're a mirror image of the hero. Sometimes they're totally different. But the thing about the villain is they bring danger. They bring a sense of peril to the story. The great trick as a writer is to make the reader sometimes think, I don't think this hero is going to make it. I don't think they're going to, succeed. And the only way you can do that is to have a villain who pushes them, who is smart, who is vicious. There's this theory that people say a lot that, the villain is the hero in their own story. And I guess that's true in a sense. But for me, the best villains, they know they're wrong. They just don't care. Them being wrong doesn't stop them from wanting to achieve their goals. Like you mentioned Greg Stilson. I would be hard pressed to believe that Greg Stilson thinks he's a good person. He knows he's a bad person, but it doesn't matter to him because his goals mean more to him than his morality. And so when I'm trying to create villains, like I wrote a book called Razorblade Tears, and try not to give spoilers, but the villain in that is someone who has convinced themselves, not that they're a hero, they want to succeed. Their goal is more important than their morality, is more important than the lives of Ike and Buddy Lee's sons. And so for me, again, you need villains that push the hero or the heroine to the limit. And then that's when you find out what the hero is made of. Because once they get pushed to the limit, can they go beyond that? How much are they willing to take? You know, like I wrote a book called All the Sinners Bleed, and the hero in that is Titus Crayon. He's probably the first really true hero I've written, because my other protagonists are heroes if you squint hard enough. They're kind of bad guys. But, I'll tell you a funny story about that. So, speaking about heroes and villains, I wrote a book called Blacktop, Wasteland, and the main character in that, the hero, is a character named Bug. But Bug is a dangerous man. He is a dangerous person to be around. And every Mother's Day, I post a clip from one of my favorite movies, 3:10 to Yuma. And there's a scene in 3:10 to Yuma where the bad guy, Russell Crowe, is a Western. He's about to throw a deputy off a cliff because the deputy's been talking trash about his mama all day long, all through the movie. And he has this line where he says, "Byron, I always liked you, but you never knew when to shut up." And right before he pushes him off the cliff, he whispers, "Even bad men love their mamas." And he pushes him off the cliff. And I always post that, and I always post under it. I think Bug would agree. And every year, 5 or 6 people come in there and on the thread and say, "Bug is not a bad man. Don't say that about him. Why would you say that?" I'm like, did you read the book? Like, he killed like 9 people. Like,
I love Bug, though. I mean, what's a little murder? I absolutely love Bug.
Listen, I am in the middle of Razorblade Tears on audio.
Yeah.
Ooh, Ike and Buddy Lee, they are complicated. I'm like, oh, wow, he did what? And it snapped like what?
Yeah.
Snapped like chicken bones. But to your question, those characters, the heroes are even more dangerous and more deadly. And so that sort of dynamic creates a sense of suspense. And so, we all know the heroes are probably going to win, but you have to be afraid. You have to be afraid that the villain is gonna win, and the villain's gonna come out on top. And so again, to that end, villains have to be smart. They have to be intelligent. They have to be ruthless, and they have to be charismatic. Sometimes villains draw people to them. And so when I'm trying to create those characters, I never look at those villains without empathy. What I mean is, I'm not endorsing that. I don't have sympathy for them, but I look at things through their eyes and through their point of view, and what they're thinking. And once I have that, then I can contrast that with my heroes. And if you're doing it well, your hero's point of view is more compelling than the villain's.
Seriously, Diane, was Colgate your secret to winning Best Smile back in high school?
Yep, and it still is. I even work overnight.
Huh?
Colgate's Optic White Overnight Whitening Pen works overnight. So after 1 week, I can show up confident and reunion ready.
And here I was bragging about my kids.
Colgate Optic White. Find it at all major retailers.
We've been talking about horror. And so in that vein, let's talk about racism and gatekeeping and inequity in publishing. You, Sean, you're very vocal about bias and injustice in the industry, and you also use your platform to support and promote other writers. For example, you introduced me to the work of Donnie's fellow FAMU Rattler, mystery and crime writer Kelly Garrett. And so what do you think we as authors are called to do as good literary citizens given the current state of publishing?
We have to speak out without fear of recrimination or without fear of blowback. Here's the thing, and we've had this conversation privately, Deesha, that publishing in some ways depends on writers of color, marginalized writers that have traditionally been excluded, of us not talking to each other.
Yep.
And they depend on us not talking about money. They depend on us not talking about marketing budgets. They depend on us not talking about the support or lack thereof we receive from publishers. I'm very lucky. I have a publisher who has supported me 100%. But also that support is coming from my editors, from the marketing team, but also I've been lucky that my books have been successful. And I think what we need to do as writers and as authors is speak out for new authors, speak out for new writers who don't have that, blessed track record of success. That when you have a debut, make sure that the publishers are putting as much money behind the debut of a gay writer, of a trans writer, of a black writer, of an indigenous writer, or someone who's all three, all four, and that they're putting the same amount of money they're putting behind that as they're putting behind, anyone else that is quote unquote a more traditionally successful demographic. And you have to speak to that. And by that, and in that vein, I talk to black writers. I talk to writers of color. I talk to indigenous writers. I'm not going to do it here, but I talk about how much money I make, or how much money I got, or how much money is on the table. You have to know what the floor is to know what your ceiling is when you go into these places to talk and have negotiations. You have to speak in a way where they know that you understand, hey, me and this writer here have the same credentials, so why am I not getting the same advantage?
That's right.
I'll tell a really quick story, and I won't tell the writer's name, but there was a writer, a white woman writer, who told me what her advance was when Blacktop Wasteland came out. And we had the same credentials. We had both published an independent book with an independent firm. We're not top 5. We both published a bunch of short stories. Our short stories had gotten some attention. So we had equal or similar sort of resumes. This person got 10 times, and I'm not exaggerating.
Wow.
I'm literally 10 times more. And she told me about it. And, it was a part of that whole thread back on Twitter. I'm never going to call it X. It's Twitter. His mama name in Twitter. I'm going to call him Twitter. But
what publishing paid me.
Yeah, it was all part of that thread. And so I think that was a wake-up call for people in publishing who make those decisions to realize, no, we're going to talk. And when we enter these rooms, people are going to know you gave that person that money. You can give it to me. You gave that person that kind of budget or that marketing plan. You can give it to me. Again, I'm very lucky. The publisher I work for has supported me wholeheartedly, but that's not always the case for people who look like us or people that aren't straight white men. And so I think as writers, we have to speak without fear. You can't be afraid that a publisher is going to drop you, quote unquote, because at the end of the day, if you're making money for a publisher, there's a whole lot that you can say that they're not going to push back against because you're making money for them.
Right.
If there are writers who have done horrible things, who've had terrible behavior, who have treated people badly, and they're still publishing, then me speaking out about important issues should not garner any kind of blowback. If you can let a writer, and we all know stories like this, if you can let a writer sexual harass somebody at a convention and they still publishing, if you can let a writer get drunk and make a fool of himself at a festival, then I should be able to talk about the things that are important to me and my community without fear of recrimination.
Speak. All right.
I feel like we should do a Ursa short fiction after hours with these stories.
With some drinks. Get the drinks flowing.
I need some names.
Blind items. We need the blind items. Yes. And, Toni Morrison said exactly, what you're saying, Sean, which is, the whole point of having power is to use it to empower someone else.
Right.
And Robert Jones Jr. and I talk about, we call it Black gratitude. And I think it can apply to, other marginalized groups too, that we experience so many of us, so much rejection to get to having the agent or the book deal that we think we have to be so grateful that we have finally gotten here, that we can't say no, that we can't push back, that we can't speak truth to power, that we can't negotiate and ask for more, that we can't say, here's this inequity and I expect to be on the right side of this because we're just so grateful to be here. Or we can't push back against agents who aren't doing anything to earn their 15 and 20%, that you can't fire your agent, that you can't ask more of your agent, and that's one of the things we talk about too, is your agent doing this? No. And we don't know what we don't know when we're new, so that all the more reason we have to come alongside folks who are entering this business and share what we've learned and encourage them.
I always tell people, new writers, it's better to not have an agent than have a bad agent.
Oh, yes. Say that.
Yeah. It really is. And, I'm lucky. I have an agent who's great. He's become not only my agent, but he's my friend. He believes in my work, and he's always hustling. He's always doing things to make us money. We're in this together, and I'm very lucky. I'll tell a really, really, really quick story. I had an agent before, and they weren't like an aggressively bad agent. They just didn't get me. They got me because they liked the story I wrote, but then once they saw the books I wanted to write, they didn't understand how to sell it. I, as a new writer, I acquiesced to a lot of things they said. You know, they changed the title of the book. They changed sort of the focus of the book. And then we went on a year of submission, and then they dropped me. And, you know, it's like, and it wasn't.
I mean, what a fumble.
Yeah.
Wow.
One of the biggest fumbles I have ever heard of.
I remember.
Talk about fumbling the bag.
But I remember when that happened, and at, you know, at first I felt hopeless. I thought, well, I'm never going to get published. And then I got angry. Not so much at that agent specifically, but just the industry. You know, I used to get the, I don't know, you might have got it too, but I used to get what I call the 3/4 rejection letter. So 3/4 of it, oh, this dialogue is amazing. Your characters are fantastic. Your story beats and instincts are on par with the greatest writers we've seen. But unfortunately, we don't know what to do with it. So good luck in your future endeavors. I'm like, what? You know? And so I used to get those a lot. And, you know, that anger, I remember watching American Masters with Bruce Springsteen. And he was talking about writing Born to Run. You know, that was his breakout album. He had 2 albums before that weren't super well received. And I remember this thing he said, I'll never forget it. He said, it wasn't that I had nothing to lose. It was like I had nothing. I had nothing at all. And so you have nothing to have nowhere to go but up. And so I wrote Blacktop Wasteland from a point of not only anger, but also a point of I'm not gonna listen to people who don't have my best interest at heart. I'm gonna write the story that I want to write. And I gotta trust myself. You know, a little bit about being a writer is having a little teeny bit of ego. Because you gotta think I have something worth saying. I have something worth people listening to. And if you hold on to that, I think that's the thing that will help you persevere, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not about you changing as a writer. It's about finding the right team to support you.
Exactly.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Because the agents are not doing us a favor. You said earlier, Sean, I like that you said, make us money. You know, that's, you and your agent are working together to make both of you money. It's this mutually beneficial business arrangement. And so that's all the more reason why we don't have to, you know, doff our cap and be so grateful to be there. You know, it cuts both ways.
Agents selecting you makes you think that you work for them, but you don't. They work for you.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Sean, I watched the interview you did on The Daily Show, and I was really struck, and as someone who sometimes struggles with plot, was really inspired by something that you said. And I'm going to quote you here. You said, "There's only a couple plots you can do. You're not reinventing the wheel here. I'm not the most original writer, but I think I'm a pretty good elaborator." I would love you to go a little deeper into what you mean by that and how that self-assessment has helped you in your writing process.
Actually, a quote I stole from Jack London. He said, I'm not the most original writer, but I'm a hell of an elaborator. And I remember thinking about that. I think because for me, especially in the crime genre, there's only 5 or 6 plots. There's somebody stole something from you and you want it back. You want to steal something from somebody. You want to get revenge for something somebody did to you. Somebody's want to get revenge for something you did to them. Or there's a mystery that has to be solved. I think every writer, especially crime writers, I always like to joke that every crime writer has a heist novel in them. They have a really good mystery in them. They have a really good revenge novel in them. And then everything else is variations on a theme. And so for me, when I think about those themes and I think about those things, when I talk about elaborating, it's how do I bring a unique perspective? How do I take those sort of cliched traditional tropes and shine them through my own specific prism? And so for me, a big part of that is writing about the place that I'm from, Southeastern Virginia, VA, 2 up, 2 down, as we say back home. And how do I use my unique experiences as a Black Southerner, as a man who grew up, 30 miles south of Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy? How do I talk about what it feels like to be a Black Southerner in America today in 2024 and 2021 and 2016? How do I take those sort of disparate issues, tie them together, and use them to focus on a traditional crime story? So I'll use Blacktop Wasteland, for example. Blacktop Wasteland is not an original plot. It's, everybody knows of a movie or a book they've read of the One Last Job or the, I love the Al Pacino line, just when I thought I was out, they keep pulling me back in. Everybody knows a story like that. How I made it different was it's not just about the one last job. It's about a man who in many ways is a man-child. Bug is a man who is, in many ways, he's stagnant in his growth as an adult. He's a father and a husband. He's a business owner, but there's a part of him who's still 12 years old, who still misses his daddy, who still is afraid of his mother, who still doesn't know who he is, you know? And so you take that sort of cliche crime trope of the one last job, and then you take all these things as a black man in the South, as a black man who grew up poor, and you force those things through the prism of your specificity. Razorblade Tears is a revenge novel. It was inspired by a bunch of late 70s, early 80s hillbilly movies that I watched with my granddaddy, like White Lightning and Rolling Thunder, sort of that. But I take my specificity of growing up in rural America, growing up in rural Virginia, and understanding that sometimes where I grew up, you can't wait for the police. So you better learn how to fight. You better learn how to throw knuckles, and you better learn how to take care of yourself and your own. And again, forcing that through that specificity, but also adding the idea of intolerance, the idea of homophobia in general in Southern rural communities, but also specifically in the Black community, and what I've seen of homophobia and how I've seen Black men react to gay Black men in a negative or positive way. And again, that's a simple trope, a revenge novel, but I'm forcing it through my specific experience, my specific beliefs and understanding. Same thing with All Sinners Bleed. It's a Southern Gothic murder mystery, inspired by shows like True Detective, inspired by books like Red Dragon. But the specificity is also, we're talking about religion. We're talking about religious extremism, religion as both a comfort and a cudgel. And so again, the plot is the basic. It's sort of like when you go to a car dealership, and you just get the base model, then your specific experiences, your specific point of view is the upgrade package. It's the sports package. It's you going from getting the regular engine to the Hemi or the Hellcat. And I think everybody can do that. Dennis Lehane, I'm name dropping, but Dennis Lehane told me one time that, there's a story that only you can tell because only you have lived your life. And so again, you combine these, you can do it in literature too. There's a classic literature trope of man versus himself, man versus the world. Okay, you take that basic trope, and then you add it to Black ladies in a Southern church experiencing life and sexuality and understanding. You take that basic trope in a literary novel and you put it in 1930s, Mississippi or 1930s Alabama with Ernest J. Gaines or Alice Walker. Again, those sort of traditional literary tropes, you take it, and every part of yourself you use to make it specific to your experience.
Do you start with the trope, or does a book typically start somewhere else for you? And then if you could talk about your revision process, because people have such a love-hate relationship with revision, usually hate, but it is a necessary and important evil. But I encourage people to embrace revision. So tell us about how you start and how you revise. And do you love revision or do you hate it?
I hate revision. Golly, I hate them. But you said it's a necessary evil. It's the pulling off of the Band-Aid. But where I start usually is I get an idea. A lot of times it's built around a trope. The book I just finished, which comes out next year, King of Ashes, is built around a Southern rural crime story, like my version of The Godfather in a way. But then I look for the specific things that are going to make it unique to the story I'm trying to tell. And so what I do, I'm not a pantser, but I'm not really a plotter. I write a synopsis for myself. It's a pretty detailed synopsis. And a lot of times it's almost like a stream of consciousness synopsis. So for instance, for King of Ashes, it's about a family, 3 siblings on a crematory, and that they are run afoul of gangsters. And one of the siblings, the baby brother, gets in debt to these gangsters. Until now, the gangsters are forcing them to use the crematory to get rid of their enemies. And how do they get out from under this? And so the older brother, who lives in Atlanta and comes home to help, is a financial advisor. He tries to use his skill set to get with these gangsters and try to take them down from the inside out. But then he learns that he's really good at being a gangster. And what does that mean? And how does that influence or corrupt or impress upon his family? How does that change their dynamic? They have a sister who's dating a married police officer, but, this family also has this thing hanging over their head that their mom disappeared when they were all teenagers. Everybody in town thinks that their daddy killed her because he runs a crematory and she was cheating on him. She was having an affair. And so that synopsis, I write it just like that. It's the story to myself. And then I write it all the way to the end, and then whatever I think the ending might be. And then once I look at it, I decide, is this a story that's viable? Can I make a book out of this? For me, writing a novel is like trying to find my way into a locked house. And a lot of times the synopsis is the key for me. It opens the door into this locked house. But once I get in, I have to decorate that house. I have to, fill it with furniture and wall and paint and so on and so forth. And so that's where the novel comes from. The revision process, I only write 2 drafts. I write the rough draft and then I do the edit draft. And the edit draft comes from my editor. I have a great editor at Flatiron, soon to be working with her at her own imprint, Pine and Cedar, called Christine Coprash. She's an incredible editor. I'm very lucky to work with her. She makes me a better writer every book we work on. And so once I get her edits, which are always good suggestions. But as a writer, there are times where you write something and you think, man, this is really good. And then it's like, why are you cutting it? Like, you feel
yes.
You feel like a little kid. Like, I wrote the feed. I'm literally editing as we speak. And she cut something out. And I was like, but that was really good. Like, that's like really. And then she has her reasoning. And sometimes 90% of the time I do agree. But there are times as a writer, you have to stand on something where you're like, no, I see what you're saying, but you got to see where this is going. So we got to keep this, And I tell you, new writers, there are things that you have to stand on. Like the kids say, stand on business. There are other things you can let go. You have to decide what are the things that are most important.
Yes.
And what are the things that you have to let go. And so once we do that, I read it again after I do those edits. I send it back to her. She sends me her final edit. I read it and I make some adjustments there. But mostly once she does that final edit, it's me just reading for copy edit now. I have friends who write multiple drafts. I have friends who write 7 or 8 drafts. I'm actually friends with Jordan Harper, and he tells me he writes 5 or 6 drafts. I ain't got that kind of patience. I just don't, man. I got stuff to do. But in all seriousness, though, I have this sort of belief, and it's just from me. This isn't, anybody else, that the first draft is the most raw, real version of the story, and then the revision is polishing the gem. It's shining the shoes. It's the bells and whistles. I have to get that raw story out first. It's most alive for me in the rough draft. Now, I have people that say the exact opposite. I'll mention Jordan again. He talks about how the rough draft is really just a sketch, and then he fills it in. So everybody does different things. There's a great quote by Somerset Maugham that says there are 3 rules to writing, and the first rule is nobody knows the other 2. So whatever works for you works. And for me, this is what works. And a lot of times after I finish that first draft, I won't look at it for 2 or 3 weeks. I just put it away. I don't think about it because I've been thinking about it so much that I want to come back to it fresh with fresh eyes. And so I try to read it as a new writer. Like I'll say for this book, I had a problem because I felt like the pacing was slow and I didn't feel like it had the oomph that a thriller or suspense or a crime novel needs. And a friend of mine, Nikki Dolson, who's a masterful short story writer, she said something to me. She says, you're looking at it non-linearly because you know where you want to go and how you want it to end. But somebody coming to it fresh, each chapter is a new moment for them. And so that really helped me as far as writing it to kind of step back and stop second guess. I think people think if you've had a few successful books that you don't second guess yourself, and nothing could be further from the truth. I'm always second guessing myself. I always start a book out like, wow, this is a really good idea. And then halfway through, I'm like, what am I doing? What are words? What is happening
Relatable.
Here?
Yes.
And then you finally get to the end and you're like, all right, it's not as good as I thought, but it's as good as I can do it. And I think if you do that and you give 100%, then I think you've done the best you can.
Love to hear about any writing rituals you have. Like, I'm trying to picture you getting to these very dark places in your mind and what music you're listening to or what you're eating.
Okay, so for me, when I'm writing, I have 3 superstitions. 1, I don't start a book until I come up with a title. I write a book that earns the title. So if the title's really good, then I make sure that book earns that title. It deserves that title. Second one, I have a recliner that I have at home, and it's all beat up, but it's where I've written all my books. So I sit in that recliner with my lap desk, and I have a beat up old hat. And I was wearing that hat when I wrote Blacktop, Wasteland, And so I have that hat. I wear it now. It's all beat to hell, poor thing. I literally have stapled it back on, but I can't give it up because I'm too superstitious not to wear it. I'll tell you something funny. So when you get with some of these big five publishers, they give you what's called a personality sheet. It's talking about you. What are your hobbies? What do you think? And I made the mistake of saying that I was a whiskey connoisseur on mine. So whenever I reach a milestone, they send me a bottle of whiskey. And so like I got a whole cabinet full of
How is this a mistake? I'm waiting. What's the mistake?
Okay. Let me pop over there.
I got some bourbon. I'm giving it away for Christmas gifts. But
Regifting.
yeah, that's right. But whenever I finish a novel, I pour myself a little dram of a good bourbon. Right now it's Uncle Nearest. I pour myself a little dram of that, put 2 ice cubes in it, and I toast myself because I used to be very self-deprecating. I used to really put myself down in interviews and stuff. And I know I've talked about Jordan a lot because he's a good friend of mine, but he reached out to me after he listened to me at an interview one time. He said, hey, man, stop doing that. Stop doing that. He said, what you do is special. What I do is special. What we do is special. And if everybody could do it, then everybody would do it. So acknowledge that you're doing something unique. That made a big impression on me. And then there's a comic book writer named Alan Moore. He wrote The Watchmen. He wrote The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, an incredible comic book writer. And somebody asked him one time, what would you say to new writers? He said, I hope new writers don't just think of themselves as just entertainers. Yes, we have to entertain, but writing is a part of a long tradition. What we do, we're the myth makers. And what a myth is the way society sees itself or the way society wants to be. And you're a part of that. You're a part of a tradition that stretches back to when we were sitting in caves around fires telling stories about wildebeest. You're important. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody else who read a book that changed their life. So what you're doing matters. It means something. Take that seriously. You're a part of a lineage that stretches back to when we first came up with the written language in Samaria. So take that seriously. You don't have to take yourself seriously, but take that seriously. And so when I finish a book, I toast, not just myself, but I toast the writers whose shoulders I stand on. I toast James Baldwin. I toast Chester Himes. I toast Alice Walker and Ernest J. Gaines and Phyllis Wheatley and, Donald Goines and Richard Wright and Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. I toast all those unknown writers, those griots from Africa that told stories. I toast those people that told stories in slave houses that kept people's hopes alive. What we do means something. What we do matters. And as a writer, I don't take myself seriously. I'm just a big old boy from the South, but I take those words seriously, very much so.
This is a question that can be answered a lot of different ways. Who do you write for, Sean?
First and foremost, I write for myself. I write for myself. When I write, here's the funny thing. I don't know if you feel this way, Deesha, or Dawnie, but when I write, I'm having fun. I love telling myself the story. It's like, what are we gonna do next? And it's like, who gets shot in the face tonight? And so like, who's gonna get hit with a wrench and or shovel? But it's like, and you get to those moments as you're writing where like, and again, I grew up in the South, so I grew up raised that don't get above your raisin, but there are times when you write something you're like, this is really good. This is really good. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm having fun doing it. And so I write for myself. I want to tell myself a good story, an exciting story. I want my stories to make me feel the way books and movies that I read and experienced made me feel as a kid. Then I guess secondarily, I'm writing for a certain type of reader, and it's sort of a nebulous person. I guess you could say it's the king, constant reader. For me, I like to think of it as just a mystery person. I always envision this person sitting in a room with just one light reading this book. And I don't know whether it's getting you through, study hall. I don't know whether it's getting you through a plane ride. I don't know whether it's getting you through a breakup. But I always want that person. And I don't see him as a man or a woman. It's just a sort of nebulous person. But I want that person, when they get to the end of the book, to say, God damn, that was good. I don't ever want you to leave a Sean Cosby, S.A. Cosby book like, that was all right. It's like,
like, damn.
I want you to feel that way. I want that book. I come from a blue collar background, so I want you to feel like you got your money's worth. If you plunk it down $27.50 for one of my books, I want you to know I'm not mailing it in. I'm giving you everything I got. So that's sort of who I'm writing for. It's me first and then everybody else.
Thank you.
Well, I think that is a fantastic place to stop. And I will quote that ideal reader by saying this about this episode. God damn, that was good.
Good.
That was good.
Well, thank you,
Sean,
guys.
thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. It was so nice talking with you. It was good meeting you in France, Dawnie and Deesha. I can't wait till we see each other again. We got to get some more champagne and oysters.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Oh, let me
Yes,
get on
indeed.
that. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you like what we're doing at Ursa, be sure to share this podcast with your friends. And if you'd like to support us directly, become an Ursa member by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll help fund production of this show and keep us going. We'll see you next time.